for others of you. But I'm Ruth Roselle, and on behalf of the Buttry Center for Peace and Nonviolence at Central Seminary, I welcome you to this Zoom gathering. I'm delighted that each one of you have carved out the time to be with us today, and I do invite you to write down your name and where you're Zooming in from to let us know a little bit about who you are. I'm especially delighted to have with us today the Reverend Susan Hayward, who will speak about the role of faith in the Ice Age. Reverend Hayward is Minister of Justice and Adult Faith Formation at Creekside United Church of Christ in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and a leader within March, which stands for Multi-Faith Anti-Racism Change and Healing. She's been actively involved in nonviolent resistance to the immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, occupation in Minneapolis, and in protection of her neighbors who are being targeted. I've asked her to speak about, what is happening in Minneapolis, what has gone on, as someone who's experienced it on the ground through these months. And I've asked her to offer some suggestions too for us on how we as communities can be prepared for when ICE may also be targeting us, especially in our role as people of faith and as communities of faith. Before her current position, the Reverend Hayward helped build the Religion and Public Life program at Harvard Divinity School. She has served as senior advisor for the Religion and Inclusive Societies program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, leading efforts to understand the religious dimensions of conflict and to advance efforts engaging religious organizations and religious persons in peace building. Her fieldwork has been in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Colombia, and Iraq. She has also conducted political asylum and refugee work with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and Advocates for Human Rights. She holds a bachelor's degree in comparative religions from Tufts University and master's degrees from Harvard Divinity School and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She is also engaged in doctoral studies in theology and religious studies in Georgetown University with a focus on Buddhist and Christian responses to authoritarianism and conflict in Myanmar, which is actually an area that the seminary has a lot of interest and concern about. She has taught at Georgetown, George Washington, and Harvard universities and co-edited the book Women, Religion, and Peace Building, Illuminating the Unseen. She obviously has a wealth of experience and education that she can draw on in speaking to us today. So Reverend Hayward will speak to us about maybe 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. During the presentation, we do ask that you stay muted out of consideration for others and because we're recording this session. And the recording will be posted on the Buttry Center webpage of Central Seminary's website when it is finished, when it's ready to view. If you have questions during the presentation you'd like to ask, please feel free to write them in the Q&A, but put them there rather than in the chat because it's easier for us to find them. And I also encourage you to use the chat rather judiciously and respectfully so that the focus remains on what Reverend Hayward is saying. And so we eagerly welcome you, Reverend Hayward, and really look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you, Ruth, and hey, everybody. It's great to see you, my neighbors. I consider you my neighbors because we are together in the Midwest, and as someone who is a little bit of a Midwest supremacist myself, I like to think that we have a particular role to play in this moment of democratic crisis and renewal in our country, so I am glad to be in it with you. Thank you for the introduction as well, Ruth. And I am very happy to share about the experiences that we had in the Twin Cities over the last several months in the role of both religion and faith and spirituality in the midst of it. And I want to be clear from the outset, and what I'm hoping that I'll be able to share with you is that religion and faith permeated the response here among the community to the crisis that was brought by Operation Metro Surge. The resistance itself was drenched in religious expression and spirituality in diverse and beautiful and myriad ways that I will get to, in ways that I think of using a Christian theological frame, Jewish theological frame, of both pastoral and prophetic. So those are the two buckets in which I'll discuss the ways in which religion expressed itself here over the past few months. But before I delve into that, I want to give you a little bit of a context of what happened here and what is ongoing here. So the surge of ICE that the Twin Cities experienced was obviously not the first federal occupation of a city in the country over the last year. We saw similar kinds of surges of federal agents in Chicago, New Orleans, Charlotte, Los Angeles, D.C., and elsewhere. And these cities experienced, in some cases, ICE, in some cases, National Guard soldiers who were ordered by DC into these cities for various reasons. But Operation Metro Surge, the occupation of the Twin Cities and even broader, the state, was unlike any of these other experiences that cities had with respect to its scale. So to put this into context, Chicago experienced Operation Midway Blitz in the fall. And at the height of Operation Midway Blitz, Chicago had 650 ICE agents who were operating across the Chicago metro area. The Chicago metro area has a population of 9.6 million people. So Operation Metro Surge, by contrast, had 3,000 ICE agents and CPB agents for a population of 3.6 million. So 6 million fewer people, and they went from 650 to 3,000 ICE agents. So it was really a sort of infiltration and a scale that was meant to sort of saturate the city streets and our experience. And that's what it felt like. It was, ICE was everywhere in our streets in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the suburbs during December, January, and February, that phase of Operation Metro Surge. And I live in a neighborhood, it's called Whittier. I live 3 blocks from where Alex Preddy was murdered. There's a large Somali Minnesotan population who lives in my neighborhood, and so we were particularly targeted. And I couldn't go half a day without ICE crossing my path in one way or another. They were driving down my streets, or they were walking on my streets, or they were causing havoc in our neighborhood. So it just permeated our experience of the Twin Cities. The pretext that was given by the federal government was fraud, in which the Somali Minnesotan community was implicated. And to be fair, there was massive fraud that did take place during the COVID pandemic era, in which public funds were siphoned off. That scheme, it's called the Feeding Our Future scheme. It was investigated by state and federal agencies during the Biden administration, led by Merrick Garland, who was Attorney General at the time. And the ringleader of it, a white woman named Amy Block, she was charged, tried, and convicted, as were several of those who worked within her network. Many of them were Somali Minnesotans. So, and the recovery of the stolen funds are ongoing. But the Trump administration blamed the Somali Minnesotan community writ large for that fraud, and said that they were coming into the Twin Cities in order to investigate this fraud, when in fact the fraud had already been investigated and the leaders had been held to account, and the ongoing work was being done apace in order to try to retrieve those funds and to make sure that everybody was held accountable who needed to be. So it felt a bit like a pretext, or bringing up an issue that was that had already been addressed by many actors. I should note that they continue to use that justification of the need to investigate fraud for the continued presence of ICE and CPB agents and DHS agents here in the metro area. So the media report, the national narrative, is that Operation Metro Surge has ended and ICE has withdrawn from here. But the reality is that there's still, according to the DHS, in court hearings, there's still 650 agents who are here. And again, that's the number of agents who were in Chicago at the height of Operation Midway Blitz for perspective. And we are still receiving a lot of reports in our neighborhoods, especially outside in the suburbs and more rural areas of Minnesota now, hearing reports of people being detained, and there's still deportation flights that are going out from Minneapolis St. Paul Airport on a regular basis. So what we experienced, Operation Metro Surge began December 1st. What we experienced in December, January, February was, again, ICE was everywhere, permeated our streets. There were abductions that were happening of neighbors all over the place. Sometimes folks were being detained from their cars. Their cars were being stopped. Their windows were being bashed in, and they were being pulled from their cars, and then their cars were just left on the streets. And so the community had to find ways to find out who had been abducted, find out who the owner of the car was, to get the car back to the family. There were local tow truck companies that were towing some of those cars for free. But it was a little like something you would see in those Left Behind movies, right? Films of the rapture, where there's just people were disappeared and their cars were left in the middle of busy streets. People were also being snatched from bus stops, while they were walking on the street, at their homes. So there was a lot of instances where homes were being broken into without a judicial warrant by DHS. So there's just these indiscriminate arrests that were happening of many people who had legal status, including people who had temporary protected status or people who had asylum claims that were working their way through the system. We also saw here, as you've seen in other places, people who had this legal status and had to be called to the court for their regular check-ins were also being taken when they came to the court for those. So they were following the legal process and were abducted as they were doing so. And then we had a number of people who were also detained who were Native American. We have a large indigenous population here in the Twin Cities, and there were several folks, including from the Ogallala Sioux tribe, who they still were disappeared. 3 of our Ogallala Sioux members, we don't know where they are, if they're still here in the state or if they've been moved to other places. So to put a point on, it was hard to take as fact the claims of taking people who were here illegally when so many of the folks who were being taken had legal status, and some of them were Native American. They didn't have an immigration story here. They've been here from time immemorial, and it felt as if, and the statistics have shown this, that many of the folks who were being detained because of the color of the skin, because of who they looked like, and that would also explain why our Native American neighbors were being taken. There were several instances where parents were abducted and their kids were left behind alone. I had a couple congregants near our church who witnessed an abduction of a man who was driving a minivan, and his 2 toddlers were left in the minivan, and they just took the father away. And so the community had to come in and take care of the kids and find out who they were and find family members to take care of them. There were similar stories. There was a woman at a Starbucks who had 2 kids under 8 who were left at the Starbucks. So it was traumatizing. It was frightening. There was a sense that anybody could be taken, and that there was a sort of cruelty to it, and lack of care for both the person being taken, but also the people around them, including the children, that we were all experiencing. But our Black and brown residents of the Twin Cities were feeling that fear in particularly acute ways, and it left many of them with the decision of, do I even leave my house? And many of them chose not to. And there are still some of my neighbors who remain in hiding, because they knew that even if they had documents, even if they had legal status, that wouldn't necessarily protect them. So many of my neighbors had to stop working and stay in their homes. And kids did as well. So schools went to virtual, and about 40% of the student body didn't go to school. So learning was disrupted, even for those who did physically go to school, like my own kid who's 15. Learning was very disrupted, and these are for kids who already came out of the pandemic era where learning was disrupted. And many of my neighbors who couldn't leave their homes then, that meant they also couldn't work. So some of the ongoing effects of this is that we're now facing a rent crisis and an eviction crisis in the Twin Cities because people weren't able to pay their rent because they were in hiding. And so we're doing everything we can as a community to, through mutual aid, to provide rent support to our neighbors, sometimes directly. I, have been Venmoing some of my neighbors to help them cover their rent, and then sometimes through more organized and formal mechanisms. ICE agents drove recklessly through our neighborhoods. They were often driving in unmarked cars, and there's a lot of video footage that you can see of them, going through red lights, going through stop signs, sometimes hitting cars or pedestrians and driving away. As the rapid response network grew and people were tracking the ICE cars, they were doing things like switching their license plates, which is against state law, or putting different license plates in the front or in the back of their cars, these kinds of things to try to evade the community surveillance that was being done of them. But there was a sense of that there was permissiveness for this kind of law breaking and a lack of accountability for agents who are breaking traffic laws and other forms of laws, obviously, in the Fourth Amendment, and breaking into people's homes without a judicial warrant. The mayor and other city officials told us pretty early on in December that they were outmanned and outgunned, and that they wouldn't be able to guarantee protections for us. So there are 3,000 agents coming in, and there's 650 police officers who were active in the Minneapolis Police Department. So that was just the reality. And so we got the message very early on that it was up to us to protect ourselves. And you might have heard this slogan that comes out of the Twin Cities, "We protect us," which is a slogan that's been here for a long time, but it felt particularly acute and meaningful during this period where we couldn't rely on state or city officials or actors to be able to respond to the threat. And so that really helped to galvanize and mobilize the form of school patrols, to have protective presence around schools for drop-off and pickup for our children, to do protective presence around mosques on Friday for Juma prayer, or during the Christmas season. There was like the Feast of Guadalupe and other religious festivals where Latino or other vulnerable immigrant communities might be wanting to practice their faith. Those who felt safe to leave their homes, and so we would do protective presence around their places of worship so that they could do so. The kind of legal observation and rapid response that was allowing us to respond when ICE was in particular neighborhoods and to make sure that nothing happened in the dark. So to respond with our whistles, with our phones, to be able to document what was happening following the law, making sure that we were doing so within the confines of the law. And nonviolently, and when possible, to try to disrupt some of these abductions of our neighbors that were happening. And as the neighborhood response network grew bigger and stronger, ICE grew more aggressive, harassing people who were serving as legal observers, following them to their homes in some cases, calling their names out to them, so to show that they had tracked who they were and looked them up through the database through the Department of Motor Vehicles, hurling insults. I experienced this myself in my clergy collar, being insulted, being flipped off, being shoved, folks being boxed in by ICE agents in cars. There's many examples of this. I can share one example of one of my neighbors who's about a 24 or 25-year-old. A lot of the folks who were engaged in some of this legal observation at the very beginning in December were younger people in their 20s and 30s. And so this neighbor is one of them, and was following an ICE vehicle from a safe distance and legally, and the ICE agent stopped and bashed in their car window, they got glass all over their face and in their mouth, and then were trying to drag them out, and eventually some other neighbors came out and they went away. But That neighbor of mine was then taken to a church where they received medical care from street medics. So the response network also developed, all different kinds of lines of care for folks, from the street medics to religious and spiritual and pastoral support and counseling support and so on, to meet the extraordinary needs that our community was facing. Both those engaged in the rapid response work, which was putting them in the line of danger and insult and harassment, but most importantly, our immigrant neighbors and those who were most vulnerable. For much of December, I would say we felt very isolated. So all of this was happening, but we had a sense that the country wasn't fully aware of what was happening here. Minnesota's, it's up there. It's cold, and it was December, and so we felt a bit like we were kind of on our own in many different senses of the word. Obviously, that changed after Renee Good was killed on the streets by an ICE agent, and then we came more into the national spotlight. And as I think the movement also grew here, and folks were taking to the streets and trying to draw attention to it, so things shifted a lot after the murder of Renee Good. It feels now as if the spotlight has left Minnesota, and we're back to feeling a bit isolated as this next phase of Operation Metro Surge continues, and we continue to face a crisis here. It might look a little different, right? It's about the eviction crisis and the rent crisis, but things are ongoing, and it feels a bit isolated again. The strong response that you saw from the community in what has been termed neighborliness, and I think that's a good description of what it was. It was really about protecting and caring for our neighbors and recognizing the acute suffering and trauma that some of our neighbors were experiencing, and the violence and the need to show up and protect one another. So that response built on connections and networks that were pre-existing in some ways. Some of it built on what was cultivated in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and the uprising and what happened here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities after that. But even going further back, there's a long history in Minnesota of community organizing, of labor organizing, of the American Indian movement. This is its birthplace, of Native and Indigenous organizing. You might have heard some of the work around Line 3 and elsewhere. So there was a lot that was already in place, but this was a very particular and different kind of threat that we were facing. So there was also ways in which we had to adapt to meet that threat. And we were buoyed by support from folks in Chicago, especially, who in those early weeks were helping us. They were sort of downloading what they'd learned during Operation Midway Blitz and how to protect neighbors, and seeking as much as possible to, say, here's what worked, here's what didn't, here's how we set up our school patrols. So we were also learning from them about the particular ways to meet this threat and adapting our already existing organizing infrastructures to do that. But I also want to emphasize that it was very organic and decentralized. There was no one NGO or community that organized everything. There was certainly no, state, local government that was organizing everything. This was being done very grassroots, from the ground up, and we were building it as we went. So how did religion show up? Again, I'm gonna put these in two different buckets: the pastoral and the prophetic, to try to organize my thoughts around this, because there's so much to say about the ways in which religion manifested over the past few months here in Minnesota. So on the pastoral side of things, as I've been saying, there was enormous grief, trauma, fear that we were experiencing in the Twin Cities from December 1st onward, of our community members, of the immigrant community, the Black and Brown community in particular, but everybody was experiencing that in some way. So We sought very much as faith leaders to hold that grief and to respond pastorally to care for the community members. And that looked like different things in different places, but one example I want to give is very early on in December when the Rapid Response Network was being created and was operating. A lot of the folks who were leading that, as I said, were 20-year-olds, people who didn't necessarily have connections to faith communities. Some of them had themselves experienced religious trauma. A lot of them are from the LGBTQI community, and so had experienced religious trauma that meant that they didn't have the kinds of connections to spaces where they could receive that kind of faith and spiritual care. And so I, early on in December, went to them and I said, what do you want from faith leaders? How can we help you? And they said, and I wanted to be very respectful of following their lead and not assuming. I think sometimes religious leaders assume they know what's best and can jump in and offer their idea of the best solution without consulting with the folks on the front line. And we were very much, as the religious leaders, in some ways following the lead of the young people who were really at the front lines of getting this thing up and running. So I wanted to be respectful of that, as well as being respectful of the ambivalence that they had towards institutional religion, some of them. So I asked them, how can we be helpful to you? And they said, we're out there all day long and our adrenaline is rushing and we're seeing very difficult things and we have to go out the next day. And we need a space at the end of every day where we can kind of center back down into our bodies. And we need that kind of care. So we launched a nightly healing space by Zoom, 30 minutes every night for 85 days, where me and a multi-faith group of other faith leaders and spiritual caretakers and healers and some of our song leaders from Singing Resistance, 30 minutes of a very simple somatic practice. It was nothing too flowery, nothing too theologically elevated, because that's not what people could handle after being out on the streets all day long and experiencing what they experienced. So it was very simple somatic practices, breathing exercises to help them come back into their body, and then a check-in with each other, and then some sort of a blessing or a prayer, in a sort of an inclusive, non-sectarian form of blessing or prayer that would work for a diverse population here. And so we kept that going, as well as there was a number of different in-person spaces, healing spaces and spiritual care spaces that were created. We tried as much as possible for those who were locked into their homes and who couldn't attend worship services, didn't feel safe doing so. How could we bring the sacraments to them? How could we ensure that they were still able to access the spiritual practices and rituals that were helpful to them in this time of deep anguish? I mean, it was sort of religious trauma upon religious trauma to be experiencing this trauma and to not, or this anguish, and to not be able to access their places of worship for some of them. So we sought as much as we could to bring it to them. So on the pastoral side, I would say the extraordinary means of mutual aid that were developed. So you may have heard of this church, Dios Habla Hoy, that is run by Pastor Sergio. It's a Latino evangelical church, and they set up very quickly a massive food distribution mutual aid system where they were bringing out 1,200 pounds of food a week to neighbors who were locked into their homes. And it became over time like a very sophisticated system. Again, it was all organic, but you could show up and you could help with volunteering with packing the basket, the boxes, bringing them to the cars. There were drivers then who would bring them to the neighbors who needed grocery delivery. There was also something called Neighbors Helping Neighbors. These all still exist. So there is something called Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which helped connect people those who didn't feel safe taking public transport, but who needed to get to their jobs. So giving rides to vulnerable community members or bringing groceries or other things to community members. So just on a person-to-person basis, being able to make those kinds of love connections. And then another one I would name is Yesod Fund, that was created by a synagogue and a Latino majority Lutheran church that has been about rent support to the community. So they have been gathering funds and then redistributing them to neighbors who need rent support because they haven't been able to work. The memorial sites, we have, this, we have experience in Minneapolis of state violence and creating memorial sites to these places of modern day crucifixion with George Floyd and the George Floyd Memorial Site. If any of you have come here, maybe you've seen and experienced this extraordinary and holy space that holds the story of trauma that happened at 38th in Chicago, and also the story of resurrection and love uprising that happened from that street corner. And so similar kinds of memorial sites have arisen in places of abduction and places where Renee Good was killed, where Alex Purdy was killed just a few blocks from my house. And if you go to those sites, you will see religion everywhere, right? I was at the Alex Purdy Memorial the other day, and there's protection cords from Hmong shaman community. There's sage that is burning from our indigenous community. There's a lot of Marys from the Catholic community, images of Mary. From the Muslim community, there's prayer beads. So there's just religious expression in a lot of these places. This is a very religious city and place, Minnesota. And so you see that kind of religious expression, but diverse religious expression that reflects the diversity of our communities here in those memorial sites, as well as in the protest itself. So, the indigenous community has brought ceremony and prayer and dance to a lot of our protest spaces and movements and to the memorial sites, as well as other kinds of religious expression and prayer. I was at one protest where in the middle of it there was the call to prayer, and so the Muslim community members, we created a protective circle around them, and they performed their prayer in the midst of this protest. So these beautiful ways in which religious expression is made in these sites of memory and in these sites of protest. And then the role of our movement chaplains is a final thing I'd say on the pastoral bucket. Our movement chaplains are a group of folks of different faith traditions who visibly, they wear chaplain hats, they're bright orange, and chaplain vests, and they show up at these places of trauma. On the day Alex Purdy was killed, they were all over in that space in order to provide a supportive presence and religious care to folks. They're meant to be a nonviolent, sort of de-escalatory presence. So they also show up in protest spaces and so on to provide that kind of care to folks. So literally chaplains for protest, for resistance, for communities facing this kind of violence and state terror. And then on the prophetic side of things, we sought as faith leaders to be a visible clergy presence on the street with our communities, recognizing the power of the visions, because we'd seen it in Chicago already, the visions of people in collars being tear gassed who are standing with their community members, and how that awakens the conscience of the country in a way and can draw media attention to forms of violence that are happening at a very local level that otherwise might not be known. And so we would, when I heard that Renee Good had been killed, when I heard about Alex Purdy, I immediately put on my collar and went to those places, one, to be able to try to provide pastoral care to the community and to the victims and to the victims' family. I was not able to do, ICE did not allow me to provide that kind of pastoral care at the sites of murder. But also recognizing that I wanted to sort of plant my stake with the community in that moment, and to have that conveyed to the community itself, that I am with you and that God is with you, and conveyed more broadly as well to the country. A lot of us faith leaders were participating with the community on forms of ICE Watch and patrol. We had I think I mentioned earlier, we did this clergy call that brought on January 20. We made the call on January 19th for clergy from around the country to join us in Minneapolis on January 22nd and 23rd. We were overwhelmed with the number of clergy from around the country who responded to that call. We ended up having to close down the registration because we couldn't absorb anymore. But we had 700 clergy who came with us. who came here to witness to the forms of oppression and resistance that were taking place here, and to participate in the forms of mutual aid to pack boxes of food at Dios Habla Hoy, and to go out and be a visible clergy presence on the streets as part of the efforts to try to protect neighbors. We have held regular vigils at the Whipple building, which is ICE headquarters in the Twin Cities. I'm going to pause just to tell you a little bit of the story of Whipple, because I think its faith story is actually incredibly poignant and important. So the Whipple building sits in this place called Bidote in the Dakota language. Bidote means confluence. It's where the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers come together, and it's considered the most sacred site for the Dakota people in the universe. It's considered the center of the universe. So it's where their creation story, where their people came from. It's their Garden of Eden. It's their Genesis story, comes from Bidote. And it's where Fort Snelling sits, where the U.S. government put Fort Snelling. It's where, during the U.S.-Dakota War, there was a internment camp there where many Dakota women and elders and children died. And then connected to the largest mass execution in U.S. history in Mankato, Minnesota, where 38 Dakota were killed. So it's been this site, my colleague Jim Baird Jacobs often says, a site of both genesis and genocide in state history in Minnesota. So it's a very poignant site. And that is where the Whipple building sits, where ICE was operating out of, where people were being brought for processing when they were detained. And to go and be present at Whipple to witness to what was happening was very important for us. It was also very chilling to be there, because you would just see this flow of unmarked cars with masked ICE agents in them coming in and out all day long. And so we saw, we held vigils there. We held various kinds of gatherings there. The indigenous community sometimes held protests there, trying to, they offered an eviction notice to the federal government for violation of a treaty for that piece of land at one of their sort of ceremonies and protests there. But there were other interfaith ceremonies and vigils that have been happening for over years, but were particularly robust and poignant during those months. And then there were several times where several of us faith leaders tried to get into Whipple in order to be able to provide pastoral care to the detainees in there, knowing that they were feeling particular anguish in that moment, having been taken, not knowing where they were going to be headed. And we wanted to be able to provide care to them in that moment of anguish, and we were not allowed to do so. So we actually filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security for access to Whipple, again, much like faith leaders in Chicago did with Broadview. And you might have seen, we were offered a preliminary injunction by a federal court last Friday to be able to access the detainees, to be able to provide that pastoral care. So on religious freedom grounds, we were making that claim, and it speaks to sort of the larger obstruction of religious freedom and worship during that time period writ large by the federal government. You also saw some clergy participated in forms of nonviolent direct action. So there was the mass arrest of 100 clergy at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport on the morning of January 23rd, our day of action. They were kneeling in prayer. They were protesting outside of Delta, because Delta had been complicit in some of the deportations, including of Liam, the 5-year-old who was sent down to Texas. He was flown down on Delta. And we felt that the Delta CEO was not, as many of our business leaders were not saying enough about the crisis that Minneapolitans were experiencing. We also did an occupation of Target headquarters and U.S. Bank headquarters, again, as faith leaders, in a visible faith presence, hundreds of us in those spaces. So using some of the techniques from the civil rights era and others of creative non-cooperation and direct action, and doing so in times in collaboration with the singing resistance movement, which you've maybe seen as well, our extraordinary song leaders who have been lifting up songs as a form of protest and community cohesion as well. Just this morning, actually, we were planning we're planning a Good Friday pilgrimage between sites of modern crucifixion in Minneapolis, from George Floyd Square to Renee Good Memorial to some abduction sites and ending at the Alex Preddy Memorial. And our singing resistance folks were on the call with us, thinking about the songs that we could be singing as we move between spaces. So there's great collaboration between these different elements of the movements here. And in all of that prophetic work, what we were really seeking to do was claim gospel values, claim faith values in the face of what feels like very anti-Christ policies of the federal government that are targeting the poor, targeting the vulnerable, targeting the stranger, and just goes so antithetical to our understanding of our traditions and our values. And so we wanted to name that with words and with actions. And it also felt like it was part of this kind of great awakening in the country. We talk about great awakenings in the past of religious movements that have aligned with social and political movements. And I can say that over the past few months, it felt like I was living through and I was witnessing this great awakening of religion in a way in this country, but a different form of religion, not a religion that is cynical and that legitimates and drives violence, but a religion that I recognized as more in keeping with the gospel ethic and values, and one that's sort of re-sacralizing all people and the land and the water in with our indigenous relatives here. And that gives me hope, as well as like the democratic renewal that I was seeing here on a neighborhood to neighborhood basis, the civic ties that were being re-thread together after a long period of civic ties being really weakened in our country. And I think the pandemic heightened that as well. And it felt like that grassroots mobilization and organizing was good for a democratic renewal movement writ large as well. So it also gave me hope. Just quickly, the things that we have been encouraging others to do in other cities. One, the relational piece is so important. So begin now to literally get to know your neighbors. I mean, the folks on your block. We ended up organizing block to block because we needed that kind of connection in order to know who was vulnerable, who needed rent support, who needed food and what kind of food they needed, who needed diapers, but also to be able to respond quickly when ICE and CPB showed up on our block. We couldn't wait for folks to come from a mile away to get here because they were doing it in 2 minutes. They were doing it very quickly. And so we needed to mobilize block to block in order to be able to respond to protect folks as well who were being illegally snatched. So building those relationships, getting savvy about Signal. If you haven't downloaded Signal yet, do it. It's the app that where a lot of the organizing is done because it's encrypted from end to end. So it's safer for messaging to one another. And if you download it now and get more comfortable with it when and if the time arrives, and I think the time is probably going to arrive for a lot of cities, at least that's the plan, you will feel better able to navigate all of the communications that happen on Signal, which can be a little overwhelming. The legal observer trainings, we started doing those legal observer trainings in the summer because we knew what was coming. And, my church held them. They were being held in a lot of places of worship because they had the space for it. They were being led by an immigrant rights organization. But to know, like, what can you do and what can you not do? You cannot obstruct federal agents who are doing immigration. You can't obstruct ICE agents. But you can record what ICE agents are doing. And things like when they tell you to back up, putting your phone camera down to show yourself backing up. So learning all of those techniques, learning how to protect your places of worship, what you can and can't do, which places are public, which places are private, just feeling comfortable with your rights. Rights aren't magic. Our rights were being violated all the time, but there's a level of comfort in knowing what your rights are, what you can and can't do, and to then be able to ensure that you're also, like that recording, we wouldn't have known what happened to George Floyd, but we also wouldn't have known what happened to Renee Good and to Alex Preddy and to some of these things if people hadn't been out there with their phones. And as you saw, there were a lot of people from the Twin Cities who were out there on the streets recording what was happening for the record and maybe someday for accountability. So I really encourage you to start getting those legal observer trainings happening often. I mean, twice a week. Uh, we were doing it in the run up to December. Um, and then a final thing is just I told you a little bit about the sacred geography of the Twin Cities and the story, the sort of long story of state violence and the experience there and the Whipple building and Bedote and so on. And I encourage you to sort of come to understand the sacred geography of where you are as well and what those stories are, to connect this moment to history going back and to the communities that live in where you are now, because all of this is happening at a national level, right? This is a national story and we need to be plugging into the national, but also so much of how it manifests and how it's experienced by communities and what the response is very local and contextual. So understanding that story and being able to plug in the efforts to respond to it within that that deep and longer story in your own context, I think is incredibly powerful. That was a lot. So why don't I stop there? And I'm really eager to just hear your questions or to hear your comments, to be in conversation.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. A lot you've been through. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll say to you, and then we'll go from there. So one of them was, how did protective presence work?
At the schools and so on. So the way it worked was that people would wear vests that distinguished themselves. So we had like bright orange safety vests, and then they would coordinate with the staff at the schools or the clergy and staff at the places of worship if they were doing protective presence there, to learn from them first and foremost what kind of do you need protective presence, what do you want that to look like. That was particularly important for like mosques, for example, because there were some mosques where they said we don't want a bunch of folks outside drawing attention to us, and there were some mosques that did want that. So consulting with them first and then creating a schedule and a sign up for folks, and sometimes it was like my elementary school here, I recognize that on like Tuesday mornings it's always the same person who is there on Tuesday mornings, so it's like just a weekly regular schedule of when they were out there. And then when they're there, what they are doing is staying logged in to the rapid response, the dispatch. So the folks who were kind of overseeing and trying to track where ICE was and federal agents were around the city, so they knew if there was anybody who was coming close to the school and they could be on the lookout, but also if they saw something to convey that to the network, and then if there was a need to get a community response, to get folks coming to respond if there was an attack that was happening. So the image that Ruth had at the beginning was of Roosevelt High School, where that was the same day that Renee Good was killed. Later that day, they went and abducted a staff person at Roosevelt High School, and then they ended up tear gassing a bunch of students there, including some of my kids' friends. And so the folks who were on school patrol there were able to tap into the wider community network to get folks showing up to try to protect the kids when that happened.
Okay, Dawn has her hand
Right
raised.
on.
Yeah, I do have a question, Susan, and thank you. I did not know that much about your town, so that was really, really good. But speaking to your children, um, when you have moms killed, nurses killed, little boys in bunny hats abducted, what did you guys do? You guys like have a response to children, and mostly to your own children? I mean, you're out there. Were they worried that you were going to be next? What did you say to them? How does faith speak realistically? Because you can't promise that nothing will happen. What did you say to kids? What should we be advising people to say to kids?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, it depends on the age, right? How much you share with them about what's going on, and with what kind of specificity. And um, my kid is 15, and so they knew what was going on, and a lot of our kids were witnessing it. They were seeing abductions happening, or like I said, it was my kids' friends who were tear gassed at Roosevelt High School. And my kids and kids always know more than you think they know. They're picking up on things. They're aware. So there's no hiding, especially from what we were experiencing here. I mean, it was so in your face and so brutal and so ever present that there was no hiding it from the kids. They were experiencing it themselves, and then they were experiencing, the schools were empty. That my kid was depressed because many of their friends were not showing up to school because they didn't feel safe going to school, and they kept learning about parents who had been, or caregivers who had been abducted of their friends. So it was a lot of checking in with them, of holding with them, acknowledging the grief and acknowledging the fear. We decided to have our kid keep going to school. There were some white families who chose not to because it didn't feel safe enough, but we felt like having the routine of going to school was important, and trying as much as possible to maintain the routines for my child was really important. And when they stayed home, they would often just sort of go onto social media and everything and go down these rabbit holes, and it would make them feel even more anxious and depressed. And the school system, like the teachers and the administrators, were extraordinary in providing that support to kids as well. But we're still in the midst of all of that. Like, our kids are struggling. The mental health issues are through the roof that they're experiencing at the schools. We're having now also, because the federal government has cut off so much of the assistance to Minnesota, childcare, food, medical care, we're starting to feel the effects of that locally as well. So it's having, like, programs at the schools are being cut and so on. So there are forms of child therapy that are propping up here. We're holding something in our church next month that is like a play processing for little kids, and it, but it's hard for me to actually end this one with a good news note. I try to, as much as possible, as a Christian and as a pastor, but the reality, Dawn, is that it's just heartbreaking, and Jesus weeps, I weep at the trauma that so many of my community members have faced, but for the kids especially, and these kids who lived through the trauma of after George Floyd's death, and then everything afterwards, helicopters, fires in the neighborhoods, the destruction that happened, and then the pandemic, and then this. It's just too much. It's heartbreaking.
Thanks. So sorry. Yeah.
So I have another question here. When you were organizing block to block, how did you vet people to make sure there were no mega folks who could mess things up?
Yes, that is a good question. Because like, one of my nightly healing spaces was actually infiltrated by a right-wing agitator with a huge media presence, and they ended up doxing all of us, and we got a lot of harassment from that. So on the neighborhood chats, what we generally did is you had to vet each other. So people weren't brought into the Signal group for your neighborhood unless somebody else knew them personally and could vouch for them. And so it meant it took a little longer for it to build, but took a little longer, maybe a few days, right? In the great scheme of things, it works faster than some of our other bureaucratic vetting mechanisms. But it was really person to person. And we also had, like, people were literally going kind of door to door here and talking to folks face to face too, and then getting them into the Signal chats.
And another one from Henry asks, is this a Bonhoeffer moment and
Yes.
liberation theology movement?
I think it is. I mean, we talk a lot about the confessing church here and the confessing church in Germany in the face of a government that is presenting itself as authentically Christian and legitimating itself within Christian frames, and the collusion of certain Christian actors. I mean, this is a story as old as the Bible, right? This is a story from our Gospels as well of Jesus naming the hypocrisy of forms of religion that legitimate and drive imperial violence and family separation and violence against immigrant communities and so on. So we do see this as a confessing church moment where I think this is a reckoning of a long history of a form of Christianity that has, going as far back as Doctrine of Discovery, but manifest destiny in this country, that in its worst forms legitimated violence against indigenous peoples, against those of African descent in the African slave trade, that legitimated the slave trade, that legitimated Jim Crow. There's this long history of this form of sort of imperial white Christian nationalism in this country, and I think we are now seeing it at it's actually holding the reins of power and overt in the most poignant way in my lifetime. I know it's not the most poignant way in the history of this whole country, but the most poignant way in my lifetime. And I think this is a moment of like, does your Christianity support authoritarianism or no? That's, one dividing question we have to face right now. But also, who is the Jesus that we follow, and what did that Jesus stand for? And so, and the question from the Confessing Church and Dietrich Bonhoeffer of costly discipleship: are we willing to take on the cross and to go onto the streets and, for the sake of love God, love neighbor, literally love your neighbor? Like, I always thought of love neighbor as metaphorical, and it is in some sense too. You are all my neighbors. We are all neighbors. Everyone's your neighbor. The Samaritan woman is your neighbor. But also, it's literally right now your next door neighbor. I think we are facing this just extraordinarily clear, for me, question right now of what kind of Christianity, what kind of religion writ large do we want to honor and follow?
Definitely. And another one is it's actually for me, but how have you been able personally, and really the whole Minnesota resistance movement, been able to maintain nonviolence in the face of such lawless violence? And where did the courage and the moral commitment to act in this way come from, do you think?
Um, we are extraordinarily disciplined in Minnesota with the nonviolence piece. It really strikes me. Like, I've been telling folks this story. When Alex Purdy was murdered, I threw on my clergy collar and I went a couple blocks away where it happened in order to provide pastoral care. But then I was there with my community, and ICE had put up police tape around the site of his murder. And we were staying behind the police tape, like we were following all the rules. And at one point, the police tape actually fell to the ground, and we still stayed behind the police tape. So there's like a very, I don't know if it's Minnesotan, the Scandinavian, like follow the rules, don't jaywalk, all of those things that's coming out here, or if it's just, I also think there's sort of a muscle memory of what happened after the George Floyd murder. And there were a lot of folks who came from out-of-state actors who came here, and there was a lot of property damage that happened and a lot of kind of chaos that ensued, and some of it that was provoked by some of these outside agitators. And I think there was also a bit of a memory of how much harm that caused to our community, and it was particularly felt on our immigrant corridor, Lake Street, and the immigrant community then built up that corridor with businesses and restaurants, and they had to work really hard to do that after 2020. So there was also this sense of like, we can't have that again. We can't have Minneapolis burn again. We have to stay disciplined for the sake of our vulnerable neighbors. and for the sake then of, drawing from the civil rights movement and Gandhi and elsewhere of like, it's more strategic. Um, and then I, you know, what I experienced and I've heard from some other folks during that period is that there was just so much deep love. Like we literally were in love with our city and with each other. And that's what people, we were telling each other we love you in the streets. And maybe it's trauma bonding. I don't know. Like we were all experiencing this incredibly intense, awful thing together. But there was genuine care and appreciation for everything we've been through as a city. We also had, the political assassinations of Melissa Hortman and her husband and dog, and the Annunciation school shooting in recent history. So we've been through a lot together, and just a deep sense of care and love that kept us going out there. And then the networks of support, like those healing spaces and the somatic care and the other forms of support for one another that was offered with love. And that galvanized us. That helped us sustain ourselves and to stay rooted in nonviolence throughout those months.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And our last question here is how can we help financially? And I think you've talked about the eviction,
Yeah,
all of that
thank
kind of stuff.
you. Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it because as the national attention has left, it means we haven't been receiving as much of the financial assistance that we were from the rest of the country. And meanwhile, the rent keeps coming every first of the month. Um, so if you go to, there's a website called Stand with Minnesota that lists all of the very even like hyper local mutual aid efforts. And so if you feel particularly connected to a neighborhood in Minneapolis, that's a good way for you to support folks in that neighborhood. There's also, I mentioned YESOD Fund, it's spelled YESOD. Um, and that is the fund that is organized by a Jewish congregation called Shir Tikva and a Latino Lutheran congregation called San Pablo's. And they have been distributing rent throughout the city in really powerful and efficient ways. So I would recommend checking out those two websites. You can just Google them and you'll find them.
The YESID Fund and the
YESID.
Minnesota website fund. Okay, okay.
Yeah. I can
Well,
send those to you to send out to folks
yeah,
afterwards,
okay,
Ruth, if that's, yeah.
okay. That'd be
Thank
great.
you.
Although probably Google would get us there as well. So.
Yeah. If you have any trouble, let me know.
Well, this has been really wonderful. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I really appreciate what you have shared with us. That has both helped us understand more of the whole situation in Minneapolis and also given us some understanding of what we should be doing at this point too, at different levels, kind of a preparing. We just had a detention center approved by one of the a city close by here. So we're anticipating there's been a uptick, but we're anticipating more. And that's probably true across this country too. People are
It
seeing
is.
increased action. But so thank you so much for that. I want to mention just a couple things. The recording will be on the Buttry Center web page if you want to go back or share it with someone. They'll probably be in the next day or two. I do encourage everybody to go to a No Kings march this Saturday. The regime that we're under, we've heard the effects of it on one city, so it would be great to participate in that. And there is a map on the nokings.org website that can show what's available for you. And then also encourage the contacting of Congress people. They're right now in the middle of trying to negotiate funding for Department DHS, and particularly to be requiring reining in ICE and multiple levels. It's a tough fight. TSA has not been funded yet as part of that, although the Democrats are wanting to fund them. But to help, to give your opinion about ICE needing accountability and some follow some rules. So anyway, there's a lot of work we can do on that level as well. I don't know if you want to
I
respond to
just
that.
wanted to I put into the chat the Palm Sunday Faith Action that's being led out of Minneapolis as well. And I you can look to see. I know most of you are in Kansas and some of you are in some other contexts, but there's different satellite things that are happening around the country. But the idea being of using Palm Sunday and the story of Palm Sunday of Jesus um, with the People's Parade in the face of the Imperial Parade and Imperial violence. Using that story to lift up the gospel values on Palm Sunday. So if you're able to plug into that, I think it's going to be a really historic and memorable um, PS to the No Kings. But
Yeah.
here it's going to be led by the Black Church and
Uh-huh.
Black Church choirs and leaders, and it's going to be a Christian expression to supplement and support the No Kings messages the day before.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much again for this time together. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this. I'm really grateful for your concern. And this will be the end of our time together, but I do pray that you all have a good day and blessings to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.